this error in the translation in Galatians 4:24. This is another Trinitarian, deliberate, perverted, mistranslation. Galatians 4:24. Paul is telling of the allegory between Sarah and Isaac and Hagar and Ishmael. How that the old covenant, the old testament, the old testimony, how that the old testimony of Mount Sinai brought forth bondage to Hagar and her seed. It brought forth bondage to Hagar and her seed, bringing bondage to the seed of Ishmael. This word bondage here in Galatians chapter 24, in Galatians 4:24, this is truly the correct word. But if you look down here at verse 25, this word bondage that was used by the Trinitarians, this is a different Greek word in the manuscripts that is connected to Jerusalem in the allegory. The translators didn't think it was very important to tell you that. The verse and the meaning and the context of this verse was not something that Trinitarians, it's not something they liked. The Trinitarian religion was built upon a foundation of hatred for the Hebrew culture, hatred, the idea of a Jewish people, hatred. In the Trinitarian system, the idea of Jewish people in the Trinitarian world is a most detestation, the very most detestation that can possibly be felt by a human being for another person, for another people, is the detestation that Trinitarians have felt for the idea of a Jewish homeland in Israel. If you notice up here the Greek word doulia, meaning bondage, The meaning of the word bondage is bondage to evil, bondage to and slavery to Satan, slavery to sin and death, bondage to bad and evil things all throughout the New Testament. It is nothing but bad, nothing good ever, never in the Bible. This Greek word doulia is serving Satan. Basically, doulia in the Bible, the Greek word is the word bondage. Someone is serving evil darkness, slavery to sin under the power of Satan, satanic influence. With the Trinitarian translators, they decided to ascribe the same word to the seed of Sarah in verse 25. Because the Trinitarians believe that the Jews should be castigated as slaves in bondage to Satan. The Jews, just like Ishmael's seed. This is the foundational core, the ideology of the Catholic, Protestant, Trinitarian religion. Trinitarians who consider the Jews and the Old Testament law to be in the same category as that of Islam and of the Quran. But they, the Trinitarians, did not have a single New Testament translation of the Greek manuscripts, a New Testament translation, until the mid-1500s. Think of it. There was not even a single completed New Testament translation of the Bible until just around 500 years ago. Think of it. The Trinitarians waited until nearly 2,000 years. They waited until the mid-1500s. Think of it. 2,000. They waited until around the mid-1500s just to make the Bible available in another language as a complete New Testament format translated into another language. That's nearly 2,000 years that it took for Trinitarians to produce a modern, updated Bible translation outside of Old Latin an old, dead, dying, useless, useless language. Old Latin, useless language. But this was not the problem. Trinitarians are free to translate how, when, and what they choose. The problem was that Trinitarians went about forcing others around the planet to also not translate, the New Testament, forcing others, banning and outlawing and forbidding the translation of the Bible under the penalty of death, imprisonment, torture, and exile. In other words, if the Trinitarian forces found out that you were making a translation of the New Testament, Trinitarian forces found out, they would be beating down your door to drag you to the nearest prison cell or just throw a fire underneath you and burn you alive, and burn and destroy your entire translation. It's not that the Trinitarians wanted to protect and, and preserve the originality of the manuscripts and preserve its message. Trinitarians, they literally did not want to see the Bible translated into a language that their wives, their whores, and their business partners, and their friends and family could read and understand. They were ashamed of the Bible. They were ashamed of the original message. Muhammad and his Islam, his Quran, had already been around since the 7th century. Islam and the Quran had already been around for 800 years already. Before that, the Trinitarians decided to go ahead and make a Bible translation nearly 800 years after Islam had begun. But let's get back to Galatians 4. Let's take a look at the two different Greek words here in verses 24 and 25. Galatians 4:24 and 25 is speaking of the Greek word bondage, using the Greek form of the word doulia, meaning to be in bondage and slavery. In every single last verse in the entire Bible, this word doulia is referring to be a slave to Satan, to be a slave to sin, to be a slave to evil and corruption, and in total damnation, to be in full bondage to spiritual darkness. Doulia, to be bound in slavery, in bondage. Romans 8:15, the spirit of bondage. Romans 8:21, delivered from bondage of corruption. Galatians 4:24, bondage which is upon Hagar. Galatians 5:1, the yoke of bondage. Hebrews 2:15, subject to bondage. 1 Corinthians 7:15, a brother or a sister is not under bondage. And we see the Greek word doulia, this same word is given to Hagar in the manuscripts in verse 24. But in the very next verse, verse 25, it goes on to say that Jerusalem, which presently now exists, is in service, not bondage, is serving with her children. The original Greek word is not bondage, it is the Greek word serving, service, serve. Jerusalem, which now presently exists, and the Greek word is not doulia, it is the Greek word doulio, meaning service. This Greek word is not used as the word bondage in the Bible. It's not the Greek word for bondage in the Bible. Every single last time, and even today in modern Greek, the same in ancient Greek and in the Bible, the Greek word for bondage and slavery is always doulia. But when the Bible uses these two different Greek words in contrast and in opposition to one another, in the way that they mean, in definition, the Greek word doulio means to serve, serving, in work, in service, or to serve in something as always with a voluntary act. It does not mean to be in bondage or slavery. The Greek word douleo simply means to serve by your own free will as a choice that you make freely from your own conscience. And the Trinitarian translators, they're consistent. They're consistent in how that they use and apply these two different Greek words. These two different Greek words, whenever these two different Greek words are used together in the same verse. 2 Peter 2:19, the Trinitarian translators, they translate it correctly. When the Greek word douleo is used, they apply the word as servant, as service, as servant, as service. And as 2 Peter 2:1 begins, there are false prophets also among the people. There shall be false teachers among you, who secretly bring in heresy. They bring upon themselves destruction. They speak great swelling words of vanity. They allure and entice those who were clean and those who have escaped. So Peter's explaining that false teachers will come with great enticing, alluring words, and they allure and entice their followers, and they seek to have servants who follow them and to serve them and serve in their false message. And in 2 Peter 2:19, these two different Greek words, doulia, meaning bondage, and douleo, are used together. And remember, douleo means a servant in serving. Douleo, a free, voluntary act of your own free will, your own conscience. Douleo, serving a basic servant, a worker, not someone in bondage, not enslaved, not trapped and bound, but serving someone or something of their own free will, with themselves making a free choice to be a douleo, a servant, freely following, freely making a conscious decision based upon their own decisions. And doulia means to be bound in bondage, completely lost, all freedom is gone, no self-will, no control, overtaken, and no longer a servant, no longer serving with the conscience, decision, in free will, but in total slavery to their own destruction. All control is non-existent. This is the difference that we see in the passage of 2 Peter 2, where the Greek word servant, service, and the Greek word bondage is used. These two different Greek words, douleo and doulia. The Trinitarian translators, they correctly translate service, service, a servant, and bondage. Verse 19, freely, liberally, they make promises to the servants, to the douleo. We see here the servants are douleo, they are serving, following in service. Douleo, and false prophets, false teachers of corruption, they follow these false teachers that destroy them, and they are enslaved. They are in bondage. They are doulia, doulia. So we have the douleo, the servant, and we have the enslaved, the bound, the bondage, the doulia. We see that, and we see the Trinitarian translators correctly use the word servant, douleo, and bondage, exactly as it is in the Greek manuscripts. And there's a massive difference between the Greek word douleo, the servant, serving, service, and the doulia. The doulia is the one bound in bondage, the one who is enslaved, the one who is trapped in corruption, an evil satanic bondage to Satan. Always, the doulia is always bound to Satan, always bound in corruption, always bound and trapped and lost and in bondage. The Greek word doulio is used over 140 verses throughout the entire New Testament. It means a servant, the act of serving with the free conscience choice that you make to serve. It's not the same meaning as the word, it is not the same meaning as the word dulia. So when we read the Trinitarian translation that says in Galatians 4:24, the Mount Sinai testimony, the Mount Sinai testament, brought forth dulia, bondage to Hagar, and then verse 25, the Greek word is doulio, Jerusalem, which presently exists today, and is in bondage with her children. But this is a lie and a completely and totally different Greek word than the word that is given to Hagar. The word dulia is given to Hagar, but is not given for Jerusalem. The word for Jerusalem is the word doulio or doulios. Let's take a look at the few of the 140 verses where this Greek word doulio is used as ascribed to Jerusalem. Paul, a doulio, a servant of Yehoshua. Those who are called in the Lord are doulio, servant. We preach as doulios, as servants for Yehoshua. Should not I be the doulio, the servant of Christ? Doulio of Christ, doing the will of God. Paul and Timotheus, the doulio, the servant of Yehoshua. Yehoshua took upon himself the form of a doulio, a servant. Revelations 5:3, James 1:1, 2 Peter 1:1, Jude 1:1, Revelation 1:1, Titus 1:1, Colossians 4:12, the doulio, the servant of Christ. Revelations 1:1, the revelation of Yehoshua the anointing, shown unto his doulios, his servants. Jezebel seduced the Lord's doulios, the servants. We seal the doulios, the servants of God. The mystery of God hath declared unto his doulios, his servants, the prophets. Give reward unto thy doulios, the prophets, and to the saints. God hath avenged the blood of his doulios. Good doulios servant, his servants shall serve him. The Lord God of the holy prophets, the Lord sent his angel to show unto his doulios, his servants. Well done, thou good and faithful doulio, servant. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who took account of his doulios, his servants. The servants fell down and worshipped the Lord, the doulio. Whoever is chief among you, let him be your doulio, your servant. Servants, doulio, were called to the wedding. Who then is a faithful and wise doulio, servant? Blessed are the doulios, the servants, who serve the Lord, who the Lord will find watching. Blessed are those doulios. Blessed are those doulios, servants. Blessed is that doulios, servant. The Lord said unto the doulio, the servant, just exactly like in Galatians 4, Jerusalem, which now exists today, and is in doulio, service with her children. You turn to God from idols to doulio, to service, to serving God. We should serve in newness of spirit. You cannot serve God and mammon, doulio. Service, do service, do service without strife and jealousy and envy and anger. Do service, doulio. Do service, doulio. Ye are the doulio of the Lord. Timotheus, a doulio with Paul in the gospel. With good will doing service, doulio. Serve one another, doulio. Serve the Lord, doulio. Serve the Lord, douleo. Serve Christ, douleo. Douleo to the Lord, service to the Lord. I serve the law of God, serve in newness of spirit, douleo to the Lord. Many years do I douleo, serve you. Just exactly like in Galatians 4, Jerusalem, which now presently exists today, and is serving with her children. Now let's take a look at the word that has just previously been given to Hagar in verse 24. Sarah and Isaac, Hagar and Ishmael are in an allegory. For these are the two testaments, the two testimonies, the one from Mount Sinai, which brought forth Duliah, bondage, to Hagar, Duliah. So the chapter is making a comparison, separating the two differences between Hagar and Sarah. But the Trinitarians, they changed this word Dulio, applied to Jerusalem, applied to Sarah, and they changed the verse to say, Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But the Greek word bondage, dulia, is not used. The same word dulia applied to Hagar is not the same word dulio applied to Jerusalem. As we see in Romans 8:15, dulia, you have not received the spirit of bondage, the bondage of corruption. Dulia, be not entangled with the yoke of bondage, dulia, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage, to dulia, dulia. There is a huge, huge difference in the Bible between the meaning of the term bondage, dulia, and the meaning of the term service, or to serve, which is dulio. Trinitarian translators take two different words that are used differently in the rest of the translation, and they attempt to use these two different Greek words and apply the same exact meaning in the same way to classify Hagar and Sarah as both under bondage. And Paul makes it very clear, using the correct Greek word to say that Jerusalem, which now is Jerusalem, who now presently exists, now, today, presently exist, compared to Hagar and the Ishmaelites. Hagar and the Ishmaelites do not presently exist. The Ishmaelites no longer existed at the time of Paul. This is why Paul makes a comparison to say that Jerusalem, which now, still, now presently today, is in existence, now still exists, and Jerusalem is serving with her children. But Hagar was under bondage, dulia, and Jerusalem is serving dulio. And Paul clarifies and concludes in the allegory, comparing Jerusalem to Hagar and the Ishmaelites, saying that but Jerusalem, which is above, which is upward on the top, above, is free, which is the mother of us all. In the allegory, Jerusalem is not in bondage. Jerusalem in the allegory is above Hagar, above Ishmael, and above and still existing today, still alive, still existing, still free, and the allegory compares one against the other. It drives down and crushes the ideology of bondage and slavery to sin, slavery to Satan, slavery to corruption that was Hagar and her seed. And it lifts and it and it lifts up and it lifts up and it lifts up Jerusalem as the victor and is the opposing winner in the comparable allegory. Trinitarians simply did not like this analogy. In verse 26, but Jerusalem, which is above, which is on top, which is above Hagar, in the allegory, which is higher up, is free, which is the mother of us all. Yet Trinitarians have Jerusalem in bondage with her children, when Paul just made it clear to say that Jerusalem is not only in service, but at the time of Paul, Jerusalem was free and above, the higher of the two in the allegory. Then the biggest part that the Trinitarians completely miss, they deliberately ignore, is the most important part of the chapter. Here in verse 28, Paul makes it very clear in verse 28. Now we, brethren, as Isaac, we are the children of the promise. Paul, Peter, James, and John, all of the apostles and disciples, the original Christians, the Jews, were exactly who the children of Jerusalem are. The children of Jerusalem, the children of the promise, the children of Sarah, were not in service according to Trinitarians. Paul was not in Paul was not in service to God. Paul says, now we, as Isaac, we are the children of the promise. We are the children. Yet Trinitarians have Jerusalem and her children labeled and identified as in bondage with her children, as Hagar was in bondage. The chapter, the chapter is explaining that Paul and all believers are the same as the seed of Sarah. All the children of the promise, the children of Jerusalem. Paul is identifying himself as the child of Jerusalem. The Trinitarians are changing the verse narrative to say that Paul and the apostles, the disciples that were at Jerusalem, and the apostles and the disciples were as Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. Was Paul of who? Of the children of Sarah? Was Paul, who of the children of Sarah, in bondage? Or was Paul in service? As a child of Sarah, Paul as a child of Jerusalem. Bondage is never used to describe the servants of Yehoshua, unless we are reading from a Trinitarian mistranslation. And this word, meaning bondage given to Hagar, always refers to bondage to evil, bondage to sin, bondage to death, bondage to corruption, and to the devil. Every single last time in the entire Bible, in the entire translation, without a single exception. Always. At one time, the Trinitarians, they changed this to say the seed of Sarah, the children of Jerusalem, the very first Christians, the very disciples, and the servants and apostles of Yehoshua. Trinitarians have literally changed the Bible to place Paul, to place the servants of Yehoshua, as labeled as the children of Jerusalem, the children of Sarah. Jerusalem is now in bondage with her children. And then Paul, in the very last verse, he repeats this again. In verse 31, Paul repeats his message. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Yet Trinitarians change it to say that in verse 25, Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. Even when a totally different Greek word is used, and the comparison is being made, comparing the children of Hagar to the children of Sarah, that defines the difference between bondage and service. in the most clear and explainable and contextable and descriptive way possible. The Greek word doulia is not used for Sarah's children, but is used for the children of Hagar. The opposite Greek word doulio, which means the idea of service, is applied to the children of Jerusalem, to the children of Sarah. And then Paul in verse 28, and then Paul in verse 28 makes it even clearer, saying that we brethren, as Isaac, we are the children of the promise. Paul, Peter, James, and John, all the apostles, the disciples, the original Christian Jews, were exactly in who the children of Jerusalem are. The children of Jerusalem, the children of the promise. Yet Trinitarians demand that Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. And then Paul makes it even clearer in verse 26. But Jerusalem, which is above, in the allegory, Jerusalem is on top. Jerusalem in the comparable allegory is above and is free and is not in bondage, which is the mother of us all. Which is the mother of us all. And in verse 31, he repeats the message again and again, concluding the allegory, saying, So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Yet Trinitarians demand that Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. And Paul is here making the enormous claim. He claims upon himself. He is calling himself to be the literal child. I am of the children, the apostles, the disciples, the servants of Yehoshua. We are the children, the very first Christians, the children of Jerusalem. Yet Trinitarians demand that Jerusalem is in bondage with her children. Trinitarians are doing this by changing and altering and perverting the original message and mistranslating and corrupting the Bible. We wonder how Adolf Hitler was so effective. Adolf Hitler's ideology drips from every single page of the Trinitarian translation. Trinitarians see these drops of blood as putting the Jews in their rightful place in judgment, as a class of Middle Eastern terrorists and perverts who deserve to be in bondage, deserve to be in condemnation, and to be castigated. The Jews and their Old Testament, their laws, and the characters of the Old Testament, they deserve to be castigated in the same category as Islam and the Quran. And the Pope especially makes this very clear, demanding that the Old Testament is the same as the Quran. The Old Testament is the same as the Quran. The Pope especially makes this very clear,